It's the Church of Jesus Christ.
But when it comes to religion, we're not two sides of the same coin, and you don't get to put your unreason up on the same shelf with my reason.
Belief in God, say the modern atheists, is a foray into irrationalism.
Your stuff has to go over there on the shelf with Zeus and Thor and the Kraken.
Belief in God is supposedly anti-intellectual, but is it really? To borrow a line from Dr. D. James Kennedy, I'm not sure the Reverend John Harvard would agree with that, nor the Puritan Elihu Yale, or the Presbyterian elders who founded Princeton.
It never made sense to say that there is no God, but you can see how people who are caught in kind of an intellectual whirlpool where everybody believes that, and where science begins to point, the narrative begins to point away from God, and people are saying, well, we know exactly how we got here, through random processes, and science now shows it to us. But the evidence from science has been coming in slowly, and I think anybody who's really into the science says, whoa, we didn't know this. Science now shows us with crystal clarity that if anything were slightly different in one direction or the other, there'd be no possibility of life.
Over the last 100 years, there have been three dramatic discoveries that have challenged that materialistic worldview and have brought back what I call the God hypothesis, the idea that a transcendent intelligence is necessary to explain what we see in the physical world. In particular, the three big discoveries are, number one, that the universe, as best we can tell, had a beginning. That is to say that the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy itself came into existence a finite time ago. The second big discovery is what physicists refer to as the fine-tuning, or the cosmological fine-tuning. Many physicists now refer to our universe as a kind of Goldilocks universe, where the fundamental forces of physics are not too strong or not too weak, the masses of the elementary particles not too heavy, not too light, the speed of light not too fast, not too slow. All these parameters are just right to allow for the possibility of life. And that raises a question: how did they get that way? And then a third major discovery, and I think in some ways the most exciting of all, is the profound complexity of the living cell, the simplest unit of living organisms. The cell turns out not to be simple at all, but instead it manifests a complex realm of informational nanotechnology, little tiny miniature machines, and digital code stored in the DNA that directs the construction of all the protein molecules out of which those machines are made. And so that begs a hugely important question. Where did that information come from? We know that software comes from a programmer, and the presence of information at the foundation of life suggests the activity of a master programmer for life.
So belief in God is not so irrational after all. Nonetheless, skepticism seems to be the prevailing ethos in today's culture.
There's always been a war against God and God's people and the idea of a God, because man has always wanted to be in charge. He's wanted to control, his own fate, to control life and death.
So I think we're seeing the continuation of a trend that we've all watched with alarm over the last decade, and that is that young adults are turning away from the church. They're embracing the idea of none as a religion, which is basically belief in nothing or belief in self. And so when that generation goes to have children, then those children aren't being raised in the church.
Meanwhile, what are some of the byproducts of rejecting God?
If you lose that idea of God-given individual rights, if you lose God, then you lose those freedoms, and pretty soon you're wallowing in the dark of atheism.
People who are atheists, who don't believe in God, believe that we're just like the animals. There's nothing sacred about us. There's no afterlife. There is no reason not to do whatever feels good.
I wrote this book recently called Is Atheism Dead? And I started the book with a quote. It's a famous Solzhenitsyn quote. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was ruminating on what happened in Russia when everything went insane in 1917, and you talk about lawlessness. I mean, you talk about the Soviet Union, and people wondered, how has this happened to us? And the answer that they gave, which is really the answer to this question, is that men have forgotten God.
And if you look at all the movements of the past 100 years in the 20th century, those were all secular statist movements, atheistic if you will, where the state is the ultimate authority. Well, they killed 120 million people, of their own people, okay? And what was the only curb against their abuses? The church, the moral people of God who had a higher authority that they were called to.
And what we're seeing now is the result of a number of decades of turning away from God, but we haven't really seen the fruit until now. And what can only be described as madness. Most people know that what is happening is crazy, but suddenly you're told, no, there's a new reality. It is because people have turned away from God. And the only question is, will there be people who believe in God, who are brave enough to say what God has to say for such a time as this? That's really the only question.
Another key point about belief in God is the fact in the American experiment of self-rule under God, the American founders recognized that the Lord is the source of our rights. No God, no rights.
Well, our founding documents, if you go to the Declaration of Independence, it says it this way: you have these unalienable rights. Where does it come from? That you were created by God, not dictated to by state. And that moral conscience is the only thing that can actually keep the state in its proper place. Well, atheism tries to wipe all that out. I love what Dennis Prager said. He said, even if you are an atheist and you live in America, you should believe in God, he said. And if you don't, act like you do, because your freedoms depend on it.
Once you get away from the idea that people have rights from God and the government's job is to protect those rights, and that the gospel says that you don't do unjust means to reach a just end, you have to play by God's rules to reach the end, then once you get away from that, then it's just a power grab.
Furthermore, most of the significant reforms in the world have been done by people who believe what the Bible says about human beings, that we're made in the image of God.
The first great voices against oppression in history and the abuse of power were the Hebrew prophets. And of course they're true to Exodus. Let my people go. Now, when it comes to justice, a lot of people see injustice. But when it comes to freedom, the Bible is unique. Have you ever thought the Egyptians, no freedom, the Babylonians, no freedom, the Greeks, no freedom, ultimately everything's fate, Moira. But here's the startling thing, modern atheism, no freedom. They are naturalists in science, and so everything's chance, necessity, determinism. So Sam Harris, freedom is a illusion, fiction. We are the guardians, Jews and Christians, of freedom. And it comes, of course, shown in Exodus, let my people go, and a whole way of life living free together. Exodus is the great precedent for freedom down through history. Or you take individual reformers, my family, Guinness family, Arthur Guinness was a friend and supporter of William Wilberforce, the greatest social reformer in history. Or you go back to Bartolomé Las Casas in the 16th century, tackling the conquistadores. All the great reformers have been people of faith. Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr. It is vile nonsense to say that the Christian faith is oppressive. It is the source of freedom.
Every time there is a calamity, a natural disaster, whether it's the earthquake in Haiti or whether it's bad things that happen elsewhere around the world, why is it that American Christian faith-based organizations are usually among the first relief organizations on the spot? And let's be honest, it's not as if that when they arrive there, they meet Hindu relief organizations or Buddhist relief organizations or Islamic relief organizations. They don't. It is Christian faith-based organizations that are there.
Ultimately, when you forget God, when you turn away from God, things happen. And the things that happen are never good.